Cek, cek, cek. Cek.
Yang ini aja mas, yang ini aja mas. Saya ini anu bu, suaranya kayak kecil gitu bu, kayak gepeng gini suaranya.
Cek.
Kebanteran. Iya ki. Ya wes. Oke. This one, and then you can just.
Cek, cek. Terus dia presenting view. Oke, good. Good job.
Oke, saudara-saudara semuanya, kuliah tamu akan kita mulai. Jadi saya mohon kita semuanya tertib ya, karena nanti beberapa dosen dan profesor juga akan mengikuti kuliah ini dari belakang, dan hari ini kita memiliki kesempatan yang sangat baik, kesempatan emas ya, untuk dapat bertemu dengan Profesor Raban. Beliau adalah seorang pakar hukum tata negara dari Fakultas Hukum Universitas Oregon dari Amerika Serikat. Ya, jadi saya mohon adik-adik semuanya tenang ya, tertib. Mohon yang di belakang mengisi kursi yang di depan. Ayo, Mbak, silahkan, nggak apa-apa. Ayo. Ya, silahkan. Oke, ya, di sini. Dan adik-adik tolong diperhatikan, dan kita beruntung karena ternyata beliau, Prof. Raban, ternyata bisa berbahasa Indonesia, walaupun mungkin kosakatanya agak terbatas ya, sehingga nanti saya minta kalau saudara-saudara nanti memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan disampaikan dalam bahasa Indonesia boleh, disampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris boleh. Nah, nanti saya akan berusaha untuk membantu mentranslate jika Prof membutuhkan translationnya seperti itu. Ya, dipahami ya? Oke, kita akan kuliah selama 1,5 jam ke depan. Mohon tertib, mohon diikuti. Ini temanya sangat menarik, dan nanti kalau ada pertanyaan silahkan ditanyakan. Oke. Ya, please.
Terima kasih. Jadi bahasa Indonesia saya tidak benar-benar bagus ya. Saya masih belajar bahasa Indonesia, tapi saya akan coba berbicara sedikit dalam bahasa Indonesia, mungkin 80% dalam bahasa Inggris dan 20% dalam bahasa Indonesia, tapi saya bisa coba. Oke, jadi kita akan berbicara tentang demokrasi hari ini. Tapi ada pertanyaan yang paling penting untuk berdiskusi hal itu adalah, apa itu demokrasi? What is a democracy? Dan kalian sebenarnya membaca artikel tentang hal itu. Jadi ayo mulai dengan artikel ini. The rise of illiberal democracies. Karena ada perbedaan antara demokrasi dan hak, civil hak, human rights. Sebenarnya ada banyak definisi untuk demokrasi. Ada definisi what is called the thin definition of democracy and the thick definition of democracy. The definition that is tipis and tebal. Now, some people define democracy as a system where you have free elections, elected representatives, and free periodical elections for these representatives, together with a series of rights of hak that include free speech, free assembly, the right to property, the right to equality, the right of the freedom of religion. This is the thick definition of democracy. But in fact, perhaps the better understanding of democracy is to distinguish between democracy as a system of free elections and democracy or to distinguish it from a system of rights. So again, ada perbedaan antara demokrasi dan kebebasan, liberty, and the rights that accompany liberty. I think that this is the better way to understand democracy and to discuss democracy, rather than to confuse the concept of democracy or to fuse the concept of democracy and the concept of liberalism. So let's look at the definitions that were offered in the article. Yang kalian, closer? Oh, okay. Yeah, sedikit keras tapi. Okay. All right, let's start by reading this quotation and try to understand apa yang kita mengerti dalam definisi demokrasi. For almost a century in the West, democracy has meant liberal democracy, a political system marked not only by free and fair elections, but also by the protection of basic liberties of speech, assembly, religion, and property. In fact, this latter bundle of freedoms is theoretically different and historically distinct from democracy. So, what this passage tells us, in fact, is that ada perbedaan antara demokrasi, which is adalah system of free elections, and what is really properly called liberalism, which is a system that protects a series of individual rights in regard to speech, to religion, in regards to property, etc. Now, of course, democracy as a system of free elections also requires some rights, right? You cannot have a real democracy in the thin sense if you don't have free speech, right? You must have free speech for a real democracy. Or you must have also the right of assembly, kumpul bersama. Ini hak dalam banyak negara, ya. It's part of democracy, the right of assembly. To come together, orang yang kumpul bersama untuk represent some position, some political position, some idea. Yeah? So it's not that there are no rights under a proper understanding of democracy. Ada beberapa hak dalam demokrasi, dalam definisi tipis demokrasi. But there are very few. They don't extend to all the other rights that we associate today with most liberal democracies, that are the rights, as I said, the right of, for instance, of certain rights of equality, anti-discrimination, certain rights to property, the right of the exercise of religion. All these are rights that do not really belong to the definition of democracy. They belong to the definition of liberalism. And sebenarnya saya akan mencoba menjelaskan apa artinya liberalism. Karena dalam constitutional, the US Constitution, ada dua teori. Yang pertama demokrasi, yang kedua liberalism. Dan dua teori ini kadang-kadang jalan bersama, tapi bisa juga to be in opposition to one another. Yeah? Okay, let's look at the second quotation from the article. Of course, elections must be free and fair, and this requires some protections for freedom of speech and assembly, right? So democracy, in the thin, minimalist sense, also requires some rights, but very few. To have a real democracy, you don't need the right to property. You don't need the right of the free exercise of religion. You do need some right of free speech, of course, because if you don't have free speech, you do not have a real democracy. You cannot vote meaningfully if you can't speak about the alternatives to the present political situation. But again, these are very few rights that are properly associated with a real democracy. To go beyond this minimalist definition and label a country democratic only if it guarantees a comprehensive catalog of social, political, economic, and religious rights turns the word democracy into a badge of honor rather than a descriptive category. So the author of this article, and I agree with this assessment, says you know, democracy and liberalism are two different things. We should understand democracy as requiring basically free periodic elections, democratic elections to representatives. But a country can be a democratic country without having all the rights that are associated with liberalism. All right, so now let's speak about liberalism, because I will try to explain to you in very few words this theory. In fact, this is a very complicated theory, and there are many, ada banyak teori tentang apa itu liberalism. Yeah? But I will try to give you a very quick and dirty definition of liberalism. Biar kita bisa membuat perbedaan antara demokrasi dan liberalism. So let's talk a little bit about liberalism and then go back to the issue of democracy in the American Constitution. Because as I said, the American Constitution protects both democracy and liberalism, but the two are different. All right, so let's talk about liberalism. And I think that the best way, cara yang paling sederhana untuk mengerti apa itu liberalism, is to explain liberalism through the theory of capitalism. In fact, liberalism and capitalism started as one theory. Historically, they were one and the same theory. Jika kamu baca, for instance, the early philosophers of liberalism, like John Locke, the English philosopher, for him, it is one and the same, capitalism and liberalism. And capitalism adalah teori yang saya harap kalian sudah mengerti. Tidak mengerti ya, dalam secara filosofi, tapi mengerti maybe intuitively, because we live in a capitalistic world. So let's talk about capitalism and then show how it is similar to liberalism. As I said, there are many similarities between these theories, capitalism and liberalism. The two theories originated from the same philosophical ideas. Capitalism is about maximizing economic freedom. When we talk about capitalism, we talk about a system or a structure of the economy that tries to give as much economic freedom as possible to individuals, to companies, to the associations, partnerships that they create. And the idea here with capitalism is that the more we give people freedom to decide what they want, what to buy, what to manufacture, what to produce, what to sell, let them decide it for themselves, and the result will be a more efficient economy, a bigger economy. Okay? Jadi kebebasan, in fact, creates, mencipta ekonomi lebih besar. So economic freedom is what we want to maximize with capitalism, because the theory says it will produce the greatest economic well-being. Now, liberalism says the same thing, but not about the economy. It says the same thing about our personal lives. It says that if you give people maximum freedom in their personal lives, you will produce the happiest society. It's not about economic productivity. It is about, in fact, happiness. And you will see that the American Declaration of Independence is using this concept, happiness. It says people have a right to pursue, to seek, cari their own happiness in the way they see fit, right? So the idea of liberalism is that you maximize the freedom in the personal sphere. You give people as much freedom as possible in their personal lives. You don't tell them, whether to go to the church or the mosque or to go to a yoga class. They can decide this for themselves. You don't tell them what they must believe in and what not, what they must practice and what not. These are all personal decisions. You don't tell them apa mereka seharusnya pakai untuk baju, apa mereka seharusnya makan. These are decisions for the individual. And this system will create the biggest happiness for everybody. So you see, it's a parallel theory. Capitalism is about maximizing economic well-being. Liberalism is about maximizing personal happiness, and they both try to do it by maximizing freedom. You see, give people the most freedom in the economy or in the personal sphere, and the result would be the wealthiest society and the happiest society. And in fact, as I said, originally, historically, dua teori itu mulai seperti satu teori saja. So again, capitalism is about maximizing economic freedom. Liberalism is about maximizing personal freedom. And they have some basic assumptions. Both capitalism and liberalism think that the government is very bad at regulating the economy, and it's very bad at regulating people's personal lives. So, pemerintahan tidak efektif, tidak bagus dengan membuat aturan untuk ekonomi, dan pemerintahan tidak efektif dengan membuat aturan untuk kehidupan kita and personal lives. Yeah? The government is simply bad at it. There are many explanations why it is bad at it. For instance, it doesn't have enough information to be able to decide what needs to be manufactured and what not, or enough information about people's desires and needs and wishes and hopes. So the government should, again, stay out to the degree possible. Stay out of the business of regulating the economy and regulating personal lives. And both theories also believe that individuals know how to take care of their own business. Okay? Artinya individuals tahu bagaimana ya mendapat atau berguna secara ekonomi dan secara personal. Individuals are self-interested and rational. This is an assumption of the theory of both capitalism and liberalism. Individuals are rational and they maximize their own well-being. They know how to do it. And so the government should let people do their own thing economically, decide what to buy, decide what to sell, decide what company to establish, decide what partnership to get into or to get out of, and also personally, decide what makes them happy, decide whether to believe in God or not, what God to believe in, what values to believe in, what to wear, what to eat, how to spend their time. These are all things that individuals know how to do and decide for themselves. And when you let them make these decisions, you get a happier society. That's the theory of liberalism. Note that both with capitalism and with liberalism, the unit of reference is the individual. The individual is the unit that enjoys property rights or individual rights of personal freedom. It's not the family, it's not the tribe, it's not the city, it's not the village, it's not the country, it's the individual. So with capitalism, if you have in a truly capitalist economy, jika kamu punya property dengan orang lain, the law always allows you to take your share and leave, in principle. You can always do that. Partnership, you can break partnerships. Property in common, you can take it because the important unit of reference is the individual. Sama dengan liberalism. Liberalism, the unit that has the right to freedom is the individual, not the family, not the village, the individual. In fact, the individual has the right to be free from the family. For instance, liberalism is a system that prohibits forced marriages because it is the right of the individual to decide who to marry and who not to marry, right? Not the family. The family does not have the power to decide for an individual what to do with their lives. The government cannot and the family cannot. It's the individual that has the freedom. In fact, in liberalism, before liberalism, parents could kill their children legally in many countries, in many places. It was not a criminal offense to kill your child. In modern societies, especially in liberal societies, sometimes we take children from their parents to protect them, right? We don't think that the family is sacred. We break families to protect the individual. So the individual is the important unit for capitalism. Now, I'll just give you some examples from cases, Supreme Court cases that talk about liberalism, and then some examples about personal rights from liberalism, and then we are going to go back to democracy. Setelah kita membuat perbedaan antara liberalism from the word liberty, freedom, and democracy. Okay, so let me just show you one quotation from a Supreme Court case that talks about the principles of liberalism, not of democracy, of liberalism. This is an opinion by Justice Stevens from the United States Supreme Court, and he says, regulation of the private sphere, that is to say, aturan dalam bidang personal, I guess, must be predicated on legitimate state concerns other than disagreement with the choice the individual has made. All right, so let's try to translate that. Jika pemerintahan mau interfere dalam kehidupan personal, the justification for this interference cannot be that the government simply disagrees with the value choices of the individual. Okay, that's a principle that derives from the principle of liberalism. The government cannot tell you what to believe in and what not, what is moral and what is not. It cannot interfere in people's lives simply because it disagrees with the value choices of the individual. A state's value judgment does not provide adequate support for substituting a state decision for an individual decision. Let me give you two examples. Maybe we can see the difference between liberal societies and perhaps Indonesia this way. By the way, is Indonesia a liberal democracy or just a democracy? Or maybe even not a full democracy. But what do you think? Do you think that Indonesia respects this principle of the freedom of the individual? Okay, so let's look at two examples. The examples are going to be the prohibition on suicide and the prohibition on pornography. And we will see how different societies look at these prohibitions, how a liberal society looks at such a prohibition, and how a non-liberal society may look at such a prohibition. So, let's start with the issue of maybe pornography. What is the justification for the Indonesian government's prohibition of pornography in Indonesia? What justifies it? This is interference in personal lives, right? If an individual wants to watch pornography, if it's not a child, if it's an adult, we're talking about adults, why not let them watch pornography? It is prohibited. By the way, it's prohibited not only in Indonesia, it's prohibited in certain states in the United States as well. But the question is, how do you justify this prohibition? How is it justified in Indonesia? Maybe I can suggest to you how it is justified, or somebody wants to tell me how it is. Please. Why? 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 So I'm asking you, I agree and I know that it's prohibited, but what is the justification for the prohibition? Why is it prohibited? How does the government explain its prohibition of pornography? Well, I think that the government simply says pornography is immoral. It's not moral. Right? How do you say immoral? Bukan tidak adil, tapi yes. From what? So you say that pornography creates brain damage.
Yeah.
Is this, what kind of brain damage is this?
Addiction. Children can be addicted to pornography. So
Tes.
check.
Okay, so I think that you're right in that the basic idea of prohibiting pornography in Indonesia is that it doesn't agree with the moral norms of Indonesia, right? But of course, in a liberal society, that is not a proper justification, because we just said that liberalism is based on the idea that in fact value judgments are the business of the individual, not the government. And the government cannot tell you what is the correct value judgment, right? So what is the justification for pornography in the United States? For example, there are various justifications that are brought. For instance, they say that those who advocate for prohibitions on pornography say that pornography brings about sex crimes. Okay, now note that this is not about value judgment. This is a different kind of justification. It doesn't say to you, pornography is prohibited because it is immoral. It says to you, no, we are not dealing with morality. We are simply trying to protect people from violence. That is a liberal justification. So when you have a discussion about pornography in the United States, it is not about morality, because in principle, the question of whether it is moral or not is considered to be the business of the individual, not the government. Now, the result, of course, is the same, right? Pornography can be prohibited in the United States and in Indonesia. Tapi alasan benar-benar beda. Beda dalam negara liberal dan tidak liberal. Pertanyaannya, jika pemerintah bisa bilang kepada individuals apa yang adil dan apa tidak adil. In the United States, the idea is that the government, it's not its business to say that. But of course it can protect people from violence, and therefore the argument goes, we should prohibit pornography, okay? Same idea with suicide. Why is suicide prohibited in Indonesia? Why is it I guess that it is part of your criminal prohibitions, right? Suicide. Also in the United States. But the reason is why. Why is it prohibited in Indonesia? I guess that it is considered to be immoral to commit suicide. It's also a religious prohibition, and therefore the government prohibits it because it's immoral. In the United States, that does not consider the government has the power to enforce its morality. The explanation is different. We say, for instance, if we allow jika kami tidak akan dilarang suicide, then people may be pushed to commit suicide by their children, for instance, so that they can inherit their property. So again, we defend people from other people. We don't enforce morality. Okay, so this is a difference. Ini perbedaan yang saya mau menjelaskan tentang perbedaan antara democracy and human rights. It's not the same. Democracy is about free elections. And you can have countries that are democratic, but not liberal. And in fact, you can have countries that are liberal and not democratic. For instance, England in the 17th and 18th century was a very liberal country. People had their right to do as they please, to decide for themselves what to do with their lives, but it was not a democracy. So again, this is a difference between democracy and liberalism. And we are going to talk about democracy, not about liberalism. So this is going to be the subject of our discussion. Of course, the American Constitution punya banyak hak liberal rights, right? But today we are going to talk only about free elections under the United States Constitution. Kita tidak akan berbicara tentang hak personal rights, individual rights yang tidak hubungi dengan demokrasi. But let me first show you from the Declaration of Independence, 1776, how the Americans were concerned. Mereka pikir dari awal tentang demokrasi, tapi juga tentang liberalism. And the American Constitution protects both democracy and liberalism. So this is the Declaration of Independence. This is not part of the Constitution. This is before the Constitution. This is when the Americans declare their rebellion against the British. And part of that document says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Note that the Americans recognize a right. People have a right, a legal right, to pursue their happiness. What does that mean? It means that you can decide for yourself what is good for you, what you think is moral, what you think is immoral. This is your personal decision. This is not a decision of your government. That is the theory of liberalism. And the document also says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is about democracy, right? The document also says, and in order to have proper freedoms, the best way to achieve proper freedoms, if you will, is through democracy. The government must be one that is, in fact, controlled by the people. How is it controlled by the people? Through elections. So let's talk about elections in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution, remember, was drafted in 1787. That's the 18th century. This is a time that tidak benar-benar ada demokrasi di dunia. Ya? Ini ide yang benar-benar baru pada saat itu. And the United States Constitution is really groundbreaking in its defense of democracy for the 18th century. Artinya pada saat itu, pada waktu itu, the American Constitution is really innovative about democracy, the most democratic system in the world at the time, at the 18th century. But of course, as we will see, it's not democracy, it's not complete democracy as we understand it today. And the American Constitution had to be amended. Ada American Constitution dirubah beberapa kali untuk menjadi lebih demokratik dengan penuh. Yeah? But originally, let's look at some of the provisions of the American Constitution. We have Congress, that is the legislative body, that is the parliament, that is created by the United States Constitution, and it is made out of two houses. It is divided into two houses. I'm not sure, dua rumah itu ekspresi yang tepat? Dua kamar. Ada dua kamar dalam US Congress, dua kamar of representatives. One is the House of Representatives, and the second is the Senate. So, in order to enact a law by the federal government, Congress is the body that enacts laws, and in order to have a law enacted, you need the consent of both houses. Artinya dua kamar harus setuju tentang hukum itu, into undang-undang, tapi undang-undang is bukan undang-undang dasar, ya, itu beda. Okay. Untuk membuat undang-undang, you need both houses need to agree. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate. If only one house agrees, there is no law. It's not enough. Now, the House of Representatives in the original Constitution is made out of representatives that members are chosen every second year by the people. So every 2 years, the American people elect the members of the House of Representatives. Pada saat ini ada 435 members in the Federal House of Representatives. And they are elected based on population. So, it is the population numbers that determine how many representatives you have from which area. This is not the case for the Senate. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, first chosen by the legislature. Note that in the original Constitution, ini tidak lagi keadaan pada waktu ini, tapi originally, the Senate was not elected by the people. It was elected by the legislatures of the states. Okay, so this was not, it was less democratic, if you will, because it was not free elections by the people, it was rather the people elected representatives, and these representatives elected the senators. And the senators, again, have their seats for 6 years. So you see, in fact, that there are fewer senators. No more senator, cuma 100. So they are more powerful legislators, but these legislators that are more powerful and are elected for 6 years, daripada 2 tahun, in fact are not elected directly, but are elected by the legislatures of the different states, not by the people in free elections. This was, of course, corrected in a constitutional amendment in 1913. So it took quite some time, right? Between in fact, the Constitution was ratified in 1789 until 1913 to change this. But ultimately it was changed for the more democratic method of direct elections to the Senate. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state elected by the people. Okay, so we see how democracy progresses over time, and that requires changes to the American Constitution. Over time, there were several amendments that dealt with the issue of the right to vote, what's called the franchise in English. The right to vote was completely not defined by the original document. So the original constitution tidak bilang siapa bisa vote dan siapa tidak bisa vote. Hal ini diatur oleh the negara, the states, and the states prohibited lots of people from voting. Women could not vote. American Indians could not vote. The Native Americans could not vote. Blacks could not vote. And in fact, in most states, the majority of white adult males also could not vote because of property qualifications. You had to own certain property before you had the right to vote. So, when we think about this today, is this democracy? Not really. Not really. But for the 18th century, this was the most democratic system in the world. And of course, over time, the Constitution was amended to provide for more and more and more democracy, including more and more right to vote. So we saw that in the 15th Amendment, the right to vote is extended to African Americans, to the black population, right? This is in 1870. Then we have another constitutional amendment in 1920. The right to vote for women? No, only 1920. That's not that, I mean, to you it seems like a long time ago, but to me it doesn't seem that long ago. 1920. Only then do women have a right to vote. Of course, women could vote in American elections before that in some states. Tapi mereka tidak punya hak undang-undang dasar to vote. Ini cuma dari tahun 1920. Okay? Here is another constitutional amendment about the right to vote on account of age. When you're 18, you gain your right to vote as a constitutional right, and it cannot be taken away by the state or even by the federal government. So these are democratic problems, if you will, masalah untuk demokrasi yang diperbaiki oleh American Constitution by constitutional amendments. Tapi ada masalah yang kita tidak benar-benar bisa perbaiki. Contohnya, the composition of the Senate. I mentioned that, in fact, yesterday. Let's look at that again. In the American Constitution, every senator has one vote, and every state has 2 senators. This means that negara yang paling kecil ada sama nomor senator dengan negara yang paling besar. Dan perbedaan antara negara di Amerika benar-benar besar. Contohnya, California ada sekitar 40 juta orang. Wyoming ada sekitar 555,000. Ya, jadi perbedaannya benar-benar serius ya. Hampir 70 kali populasi California daripada populasi Wyoming. Tapi mereka punya kuasa yang sama di US Senate. Ya, ini sedikit gila untuk demokrasi. Tapi tidak bisa perbaikinya. Kenapa tidak bisa perbaikinya? Karena sebenarnya the Constitution says no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. What this says is that you cannot change the representation, the equal representation of states in the Senate without the agreement of all the states. And of course, the small states will never agree to change, to take away their power. Right? Why will they agree? Never. It will never happen. It did not happen, and it will not happen. So, this is the question that I raised yesterday. Saya mau ulangi pertanyaan saya dari kemarin. Mungkin jika kita tidak bisa dalam keadaan ini, kita tidak bisa berubah konstitusi untuk membuat the Senate lebih demokratik. Maybe we can do it in 2 steps. The first step, we erase this without the consent of all the states, and then we take away the equal representation in the Senate. So, can we do that? That is an interesting question, yeah? It's the question, somebody will come before the courts and say, hey, come on, they cannot change that. Because the whole point was that the small states agreed to join the United States only on the condition that they have equal representation in the Senate. Forever, or at least until they agree not to. So, this is an interesting question because it shows that maybe there are unconstitutional constitutional amendments. Maybe there are things that you cannot change in your constitution. And again, this is a very interesting concept. And it is an idea that some courts in the world, in fact, agreed with. For instance, the Indian Supreme Court. Okay, but let's continue now and look at some other aspects of the American Constitution's protection of democracy. And in fact, you read for today 2 cases, and these 2 cases are good demonstrations of how some rights, some individual rights, in fact, protect democracy in the United States. And these rights, they are both pertain to the freedom of speech. Remember, we said that in fact democracy, proper democracy, sebenarnya benar-benar perlu beberapa hak. Tidak banyak hak, tapi beberapa hak, termasuk freedom of speech. You need, for a real democracy, you need the freedom of speech. And please.
So thank you for the opportunity. I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Jovita Helena Tebuti from Class L, and I would like to ask a question. How could constitutional protection on freedom of speech and press in the case of defamation could give ease for individuals or groups to spread false information, rather even inflict loss to public functionaries? Thank you.
So the question was about the freedom of speech, whether there is a right to free speech to disseminate false information. All right, this is exactly what we are going to talk about now. Kita akan berbicara tentang hal itu. Jika the constitutional protection for free speech in America also protect false information. Artinya informasi palsu, yang tidak benar. Yeah? And in fact, from the cases, one of the cases that you read for today, you could see that the First Amendment protects the dissemination of false information. All right, so let's look first at the First Amendment, and then we'll look at that particular case. And we'll ask, kita akan bertanya, kenapa Undang-Undang Dasar Amerika, in fact, lindungan, protect the dissemination of false information, informasi yang tidak benar. But there are such protections. So, the freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. We mentioned that yesterday. And the case that you read for today, here is a description of that case. We'll go over it quickly. Is a case that is decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1964. Now, these are tahun-tahun itu, tahun 50, 60, 70 adalah tahun benar-benar penting untuk hukum undang-undang di dasar di Amerika. It was a time of big changes and lots of the extension of constitutional protections. And part of the story at that time, during the 50s and the 60s, we get the civil rights movement in the United States. Does anybody here know what is the civil rights movement in the United States that started in the 50s, the 1950s? Did you hear about that? The civil rights movement was the movement of African Americans for equality in the United States. So again, this is in fact a revolutionary movement that begins in 1950s and lasts for about 15, 20 years and brings big changes to American law that advance the equality of African Americans. In fact, up until to the 1950s, there was racial segregation in some states in the United States. Racial segregation means that blacks and whites lived in different neighborhoods, went to different schools, went to different swimming pools, movie theaters, even different public bathrooms. And this was required by law. This was forced by law in some states in the United States. Of course, not in all of them, but in some states, this was a legal requirement. Contohnya, it was a criminal offense, itu hal untuk hukum pidana, to date somebody from another race. They could put you in prison for that. It was associating, it was the language of the law was associating with somebody from a different race. Let alone marriage. Marriage was, of course, between the races was, of course, prohibited. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is the movement that brought all this to an end. Keadaan ini sebenarnya selesai sekitar tahun-tahun itu. Thanks to the civil rights movement. This is a case that begins with an event with the civil rights movement. And it is a lawsuit in defamation. Bagaimana bilang defamation dalam bahasa Indonesia? Penghinaan, libel, defamation, yeah? So this is a lawsuit that seeks money damages for tarnishing somebody's reputation, yeah? Bilang sesuatu yang jelek tentang orang lain, yeah? And harming their reputation. This is, to this day, all over the world, there are laws that allow you to sue people and ask for money if they say or write something about you. They say, for instance, that you're a criminal, or that you're a thief, or that you are dishonest, that you are a bad person. You can sue them, but of course, in most cases, you have to show that what they say is false. If what they say is true, in fact, this is a defense for the charge, right? By the way, this is not always the case. In Korea, you can sue somebody for defamation even if what they said is true. Yeah, if you can show that they said it intentionally to harm you. That's very weird, but you do have some countries that allow for defamation lawsuits, and truth is not a full defense. But in any event, in the United States, truth is a defense. The problem here was that there was a newspaper, in fact it was an ad, it was a newspaper ad that claimed that the police department in Montgomery, Alabama is a southern state that separated the races. It said that the police department there reacted with violence and violations of people's rights in reaction to the demonstrations, the civil rights demonstration. Okay? This was what the publication in the newspaper said. The problem was that the details were not correct. Artinya hal yang benar-benar tidak penting. Contohnya lagu yang mana mereka nyanyi. It wasn't the correct one. Or they said 50 orang were arrested, but in fact it was 45. But the law at the time allowed the suit for defamation, even if the falsities, the untruth, were small and insignificant. So there was a suit against the New York Times, a very famous newspaper to this day, probably the most important American newspaper, asking for lots of damages. This was a lawsuit by the police commissioner, by the head of the police in Montgomery, Alabama. And the suit was for $500,000. Lots of money, especially in 1964. Yeah? Paniaguan. And he won. Because it was a jury in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and the jury was made out of only white people. No black people were allowed on the jury. This was appealed to the federal courts and then to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court made a decision here that is very important for American democracy. And maybe mungkin kita bisa nanti coba making a comparison dengan hukum Indonesia. Okay? So, the court said this lawsuit is unconstitutional. The newspaper, what it published, was protected by the freedom of speech, even if the claims were not true. Okay, so again, this is in response, saya jawab pertanyaan dulu, ya. Pertanyaan adalah Undang-Undang Dasar Amerika lindungi palsu. And the answer is yes, here it protected falsities. Because remember, for defamation you need to show that this is untrue, that this is false. And the court says, yes, they show that it is untrue, but still it is protected constitutionally. And this is what the court said. It said first, the evidence was constitutionally defective. It was incapable of supporting the jury's finding that the allegedly libelous statements were made often concerning respondents. So the first thing the court says is, you cannot sue for defamation because somebody criticizes the police. You need to sue only if somebody says something false about an individual. In other words, the newspapers, the journalists, and individuals in the United States can say everything they want about the government in general, if it's not about an individual, even if it's untrue. They can tell lies about the government, and the government cannot do anything about it. It is constitutionally protected. Soon we will ask why. Why do we protect falsities or misinformation, right? Because we know today it is a big problem for democracies. But under the American Constitution, people are protected, even if they say false things, hal yang tidak benar tentang pemerintah. Ada constitutional right to say it, even if it's untrue. Okay? So the first thing the court says, this was criticism of the police, not of a man, not of a particular individual, and therefore it's unconstitutional to give awards in this case. And then the court also said that in fact, even if it was about an individual, even if you say something false about, for instance, the president, you disseminate false information about the state. You accuse the president of being a criminal. You say that the president is corrupt. The president took money from some construction businessman. Okay? And it is untrue. Still, the president cannot sue you for damages, cannot get damages from you, unless you can prove that the person who was making, or the newspaper that was making the accusation, knew that the accusation was false. Okay? So, if, for instance, if the person was simply negligent, you're a journalist, somebody comes to you and say, listen, I have information about the president is corrupt. You can publish it in your newspaper. I met somebody that gave him money, blah, blah, blah. And you know, it's very late in the day and you're hungry and you don't really check. You're being negligent, right? Negligence is something, I guess, that we all are guilty of many times every day. In driving, in eating, what have you. If you're being only negligent, you cannot be held liable for it. Negligence alone in publishing false information is protected. Right? You need to show that, in fact, there was intention to lie. If you show that there was intention to provide false information, then this is not protected. All right, so first we need to distinguish, for your question, we need to distinguish between false information where the person knows that the information is false, and false information that the person doesn't know that the information is false. She may think it's correct. Even if she thinks it negligently, it's still protected. Now, why? Why protect false information? Anybody can think, why? I mean, it's false, right? Why do we protect the freedom to say things that are not true?
So the country still gives change to the people to tell whatever they want. I mean, like because yeah, because it's a respect to the freedom of speech. So even though it's not is a untruth information or is a false information. The most important thing is the people can still tell what they want or can still speak what they want.
Jadi
Maybe
saya
that's it.
bertanya, kenapa orang di Amerika punya hak bilang sesuatu yang tidak benar? Dan jawaban kamu
Mungkin
adalah bahwa mereka punya hak untuk bilang
mungkin
semua.
ini karena negara itu mengesampingkan dulu, bukan mengesampingkan, mungkin lebih tepatnya seperti negara mengizinkan dulu orang itu untuk berbicara, jadi dikesampingkan dulu itu antara kebenaran atau enggaknya dan baru diselidiki kebenaran atau enggaknya nanti gitu loh. Mungkin seperti itu.
Nanti saya tidak benar-benar mengerti. Nanti apa? Jadi saya saya bertanya, kenapa ada hak ya berbicara dan bilang sesuatu yang tidak benar, dan jawaban tidak bisa karena kita bisa bilang semua itu tidak benar ya. Pemerintahan contohnya bisa dilarang spying, to be a spy. Itu secara berbicara ya. Spies, they talk. They go and they meet agents from other countries and they tell them secrets. But of course, the government makes it a serious crime, yeah? You can go to prison for 20 years for this. So we don't have a right to say anything. Here is another example. I come to somebody and I say, I'll give you $1,000 to kill my girlfriend. Well, of course, this is solicitation for murder. You cannot do that, right? It's forbidden. So it's not that we can say everything. Some things the government can prohibit, and some things it cannot. And my question is, why do we not allow the government to prohibit dissemination of false information? Is there value in false information? There is no value in false information? Please.
Journalism, I think it is.
So you think the journalist must first check?
Oh, no. It is the press right to criticize or condemn the government, and it is the press duty to prevent any parts of the government from deceiving its people. So checks and balances so that.
Yeah, but this is criticism that is false. We are talking about false information. Well, why? Why do we protect it? Why do we protect false information? So the question again is this: why not prohibit journalists from publishing information that is harmful to certain government officials and is wrong? Why? Why not? Please. Well, what we're talking about democracy, not about liberalism. Why is it important for democracy to protect this? Well, the first thing is that many times the journalists do not really know, and they cannot know, right? Journalists receive information. Now, I'll tell you what happened before this case was decided. A journalist will receive information that there is a corrupt government official. And he will go to his boss and say, "Boss, I have great information that the governor is corrupt." And the boss will say, "Well, where's the proof?" And the journalist will say, "Well, I don't have proof. I have some sources, I have some descriptions, but I don't have proof." And the editor will say, "Well, until you get the proof, we cannot publish it. Because if we publish it before we have a proof, they are going to sue us. And we are going to have to pay $500,000 and close the newspaper." Right? So with this constitutional right, we allow journalists to publish bad information about the government, critical information, even if it is false, even without proof that it is correct, unless they knew that it was false. We give journalism some space to come forward with information and not be afraid of lawsuits, even if they don't have proof that it is correct. Okay, so this is important for journalism, because before this decision, there was lots of information that newspapers simply did not publish because they were afraid of legal liability. Mereka takut bahwa harus bayar banyak uang jika tidak ada bukti to show that this is correct. So this is one thing that, so here we are protecting the circulation of information in this decision. Again, false information as well, because it may be false. Let's look at how the Supreme Court says that, please. What happened? You just restarted? Hang on, we have 20 minutes to go. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel, huh? Sure, please.
Was there any idea from some states that thinking about like this freedom of speech in context with false accusation to change the law? I mean, is there? Oh, I think this is not good for common good. It's bad for common good to let the false accusation spread, or it just it's okay as long as there is no, as long as there's no proof to this false accusation, it doesn't really matter. I mean, was it really any idea to from any state to change this kind of law from freedom of speech?
Jadi saya pikir mungkin pertanyaan ini berhubungan dengan hubungan antara federal government dan states, ya. Jika ini hak federal dan United States Supreme Court is a federal court, jadi ini hak free speech, hak federal, the states cannot change it. Tidak bisa berubah, tidak bisa interfere with the federal right. In fact, tomorrow I will give I think to a different group of students, we'll talk about federalism. But yeah, the states cannot interfere with this, even if they want to. That is federalism. Usually there is a setting that it doesn't go to sleep if the PowerPoint is on, right? Huh? Okay, so one reason why we protect false information is to give journalists the ability to publish information that they do not know if it is true or not true, right? And so they don't have to worry that if it comes out that the information is not true, they will have to pay for it, right? So this is the main reason why we protect false information. But there are other reasons as well. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in fact, provided another interesting reason. The court said, if we don't allow people to say false things, if we don't allow people to disseminate false information, we can never really know the truth. Because to know the truth needs to confront and meet the lie. So if you forbid the lie, it's going to be very difficult to recognize what is true. Jadi, we allow for false information and protect the ability of people to say false things because we are not afraid of the competition of ideas between the truth and what is false. And again, this is quite a uniquely American idea. Because many countries say, no, we are afraid of false information, and therefore we will not allow it. But in the American way of thinking about free speech, we say, let the competition win. Let the ideas compete with one another, the false idea and the true idea. And this is how we learn what is true. Now, this does not mean that truth always wins, right? Nobody is naive enough to think that truth always wins. Sometimes the false information wins. But in the long term, this is the best way that we have as a society to understand what is correct and what is not, what is true and what is not. By allowing the lies or allowing the false information and the true information to compete and to be circulating freely in the marketplace of ideas, as they say it. All right, now, I said to you basically what the Supreme Court said, and I want to finish with a very interesting, the last case that we have, because the last case is a demonstration of the extreme protection that free speech receives in the United States. So we, in fact, saw one example, satu contoh untuk protections benar-benar kuat dalam US Constitution for free speech. But now we are going to see another example of the strong protections for free speech and for democracy in the United States Constitution. And this is a case about a man who worked for the Defense Department in the United States during the Vietnam War. So he was working in a top secret place for the American Defense Department. He was himself a Marine who served in Vietnam, and then he went back to work in Washington. Dia kembali dari Vietnam ke Washington dan mendapat pekerjaan dengan the US Department of Defense sebagai analis. Dia analis informasi tentara. Ya? And in his work, dia lihat a paper, research documents, top secret research document. Artinya rahasia secara hukum, ya, top secret documents about the Vietnam War. This is at the time that the Vietnam War was still going on, 1970. This is happening. His name is Daniel Ellsberg. In fact, he just died a few days ago. He passed away. Dia meninggalkan beberapa hari yang lalu. Daniel Ellsberg, so he's an analyst for the Department of Defense. When he sees documents, top secret documents about the Vietnam War, and these documents show that the American government was lying to the American people about the Vietnam War. For many years, they were lying. They had information that the war was not succeeding, and they kept telling to the American people that the war was succeeding. There was also information there about the reason that the United States went to war in Vietnam. And this top secret document showed the stupidity and the mendacity of the American government. It showed that the American government was both stupid and was a liar to the American people. So this was classified as top secret. Daniel Ellsberg began photocopying these documents. These were thousands of pages. And he did that over several months. Every evening he took some papers in his suitcase and then Xeroxed it with a machine. Nowadays it's much easier to be a spy. Nowadays you just put everything on a flash drive. But for Daniel Ellsberg it was very difficult. He had to work for months to photocopy one by one thousands of pages that showed these thousands of top secret documents. Then he tried to give the document, in fact, at first to United States congressmen, because the United States Constitution protects the ability of members of Congress from any criminal liability for what they say in Congress. So if you're a congressman in the United States, you can say anything you want on the floor of Congress, and you are immune from liability. So he tried to give these documents to congressmen that disagreed with the Vietnam War and said to them, please read it in Congress. But they all refused. They were afraid to violate the law. They said this is top secret, and even if I'm immune, still this may be politically damaging. So what he did, he gave these documents to the New York Times. Remember the newspaper from the previous case as well. The New York Times took these documents and sent 4 journalists to a secret hotel room in Washington, D.C. They paid for them to stay in the hotel for 3 months to go over the documents, to figure out if the documents were authentic and to take out parts that may be dangerous to American soldiers. And after 3 months, in June 1971, the New York Times took these top secret documents and started publishing them in the newspaper. in the morning newspaper, this was the first page, was a top secret classified document of the American military. And the government, of course, went crazy. It said, we are going to throw you all in prison. You have to stop. And it ran to the courts and asked the courts to stop. And the case came before the United States Supreme Court. Very quickly, they decided the case in a few days. And they said, that cannot be stopped. The right to free speech in the United States allows the newspapers to publish top secret military document. Please. Here. Thank you.
Before that, introduce myself. My name is Gracia Irana. I am from class of L. I want to ask a question about what is the implication of the court decision on the case of Oregon paper case to the balance of press freedom and protection on national needs. Moreover, in the context of foreign policy and the state's security or safeness. Thank you. This case? Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so first, ayo selesai berdiskusi kasus ini. Jika ada waktu, saya coba menjelaskan kenapa itu kasus benar-benar penting. Ya. So, again, the court says something very interesting. The court said, you cannot stop the publication of these top secret documents. What you can do is, after the publication, it says that to the government, after the publication, if you want, you can charge the journalists and the editors with violations of criminal law for disclosing secret documents. But you cannot stop the publication. Why? So again, listen to what the court said. The court said, you cannot stop the publication of these top documents. You can put these people in prisons later, after they publish it, but you cannot stop the publication. What's the logic? Well, the court said the logic is that we want dissemination of information. Okay? We want information to circulate. It's the same idea with the false information from before, right? The American system says the information will get to the public. Then, after the information gets to the public, maybe there are violations of the criminal law. And then we may allow the government to take them to criminally charge them. But we are not going to allow the government to stop the publication. The publication can continue. Now again, this is another very extreme example of the very strong protections that information receives in the United States, right? You can, if you're a newspaper, you can publish false information, false defamatory information about politicians and the government. Again, even if it's untrue, and even if it tarnishes the reputation, you are protected completely, in fact. And in fact, if you're a newspaper, you can also publish, for the most part, top secret government documents. They cannot stop the publication. They may try to sue you later. In this case, for instance, the government never tried to take them to charge anybody with criminal offense. And the publication was allowed to continue. So these are two examples of how the freedom of speech in the United States is extremely protective of democracy as the idea of free elections that requires the free flow of information. Now, the question you asked is, what is the significance of this case? Significance is this: the American government cannot stop the publication of a document simply by saying this is top secret. If a journalist can obtain the document, they have a source inside the government. They can obtain the document, that happens all the time. Even if it's top secret, you can go ahead and publish it without fear. Yeah? They essentially without fear. So this is again a very important decision about the rights of the public to information, even if this information is classified by the government, and the government can try to do everything it wants to prevent its publication, there's still a right to publish it. Okay, wow, this was a long session, yeah? Please.
Greetings, Professor. Beforehand, I would like to say thank you for giving us opportunity to learn about new things, which in this case is about the democracy. My name is Hamyong. I'm a freshman, semester 1 student of Law Faculty Brawijaya University from the class of L, which is taught by Miss Icha. On this occasion, I would like to ask about free speech. So the question is, although hate speech is categorized as a free speech and it is allowed according to the First Amendment, I wonder how high the US government upholds the principles of free speech. Has there ever been any cases of government officials violate their people's freedom to express their free speech? If so, how often does this happen? Thank you.
So I guess that you're asking how many laws, maybe I can try to rephrase your question. How many laws were enacted that the courts invalidated because they violated free speech?
Yes.
Yes, well, quite a lot. The government is always happy to silence speech. This is an interesting point about the right to free speech, that in distinction, for example, to the right to equality. The government does not necessarily want to violate the right to equality. Why would it? Maybe it doesn't care. But with speech, the government always cares, because the way to perpetuate the government and the way to accumulate political power is by silencing your opponent's speech. That's why when the court analyzes free speech, they use a test that is more severe than the test that they use, for instance, when somebody says the government is violating the principle of equality or the principle of the freedom of religion. Because the idea is that the government may not care about equality or the freedom of religion, but it doesn't have an interest in violating it. But with free speech, the government always have an interest in suppressing free speech. And that's why, again, it is one of the most well-protected rights under the American Constitution. Because we all understand that the government has a tendency and an interest and an inclination to violate that very important constitutional right. Please.
Since I'm just going to go backwards. Since we're talking about democracy and looking at the rules on how then democracy is to achieve equality itself, but then there is still some aspects of the democracy that not giving the equality. Is there any chance or probability that the democracy will be ideal in the future? Like everyone will get the same equal rights, for example, but then without hurting anyone's right as well.
So remember the distinction between democracy and liberalism. Democracy is obligated to one kind of equality only, equality in voting, and equality in free speech, because it is part of free elections and free votes, right? But democracy is not committed to other forms of equality. For instance, you have a number of democracies in the world, illiberal democracies, where the people vote in free elections, and then they enact laws that discriminate against some minority groups. This does not mean that these countries are not democratic. It means that these countries are not liberal, but not that they are not democratic. The equality that democracy is committed to is an equality of the right to vote and the right to speak about politics and to make political parties, but not all the other forms of equality that I think you had in mind when you asked your question. Please.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Syafri Alizki Ibnuda Pratama from the class of L, same with Hamyong. So back to the case, it is concluded that the free of speech is above the power of the top secret. So what is the point of the top secret anyways, if there is no power to stop the free of speech before? Thank you.
If it is top secret, the government can in fact put in prison the government employee that released that information. That is what it means that it's top secret. The government cannot prevent the newspaper from publishing it, but it could put Daniel Ellsberg in prison, and he tried to put him in prison for 100 years. Daniel Ellsberg was in fact prosecuted for violating laws that forbade the disclosure of secret information. And if he would have been found guilty, he would have sat in prison for 115 years. Now we'll finish with this very interesting story about Daniel Ellsberg. The prosecution against Daniel Ellsberg was dismissed by the judge. The judge dismissed the whole case and threw it out because the government, it was disclosed, was in fact broke into the office of the doctor of Daniel Ellsberg in order to get information from the psychiatrist of Ellsberg, and violated a number of other laws when he tried to prosecute him. And the federal judge, in a very interesting, said, this prosecution is too dirty, and I am finishing it. End of story. Released Daniel Ellsberg, and Daniel Ellsberg was never prosecuted for what he did. Thank you very much. Can we have some questions? Should we continue, or you need to go to another class? Only one question. Please. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So talking about democracy and constitution, we have election in February, it's just right around the corner. We do know that in the United States, you guys have the midterm election where the member of the Congress have an election in during halfway of their period. But in Indonesia, we don't have such thing, which surprises me. We do know in America there's only two parties, so you are either government or opposition. But unlike in Indonesia, there are multi-parties, and we right now barely have opposition. There's only Democrats and PKS. So how can we maintain the health of our democracies if we don't have the midterm elections? Like during Trump's administration or Biden's, Democrats lost their majority in the House, or maybe Republicans lost their majority in the House, which makes the president harder to pass a bill. So it's in Indonesia, people be thinking like, we got to unite, all the parties got to unite, let there no opposition. But I think it's not good for the health of our democracies. So how can we, upaya apa yang bisa kita lakukan untuk menjaga demokrasi itu agar partai itu tidak semuanya masuk koalisi pemerintah, but also the opposition bloc is strong as well. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I'll say several. First, I think that there are many different ways with which a democracy can operate as a democracy. So there's not just one way with which a democracy is structured. You know, Americans used to lecture the world a lot about democracy for many years. But we just saw, for example, that under the United States Constitution, the Senate is not really a real democracy. And in fact, the presidential elections in America is also not in accordance with real democracy. You know, President Trump was elected with 3 million votes less than Hillary Clinton, because this is the system that the Constitution created. And after January 6th and what happened with the elections in the United States, I just think it is not completely proper for me to lecture about democracy. So thank you for the question, and thank you everybody for attending the lecture. Have a good
Okay,
night.
please give applause to Professor Fraban. Well, I know that I'm looking for your face and there is a lot of question inside your mind, but this is really interesting. We still have the last day for our jazz lecture for tomorrow, yeah, Wicha, and we still invite you to join our jazz lecturer. And Professor Rabat, thank you so much. You know, we really want to ask a lot of things, but we don't have any enough time. So thank you very much. Wish you enjoy your day in Malang, and we will see you in tomorrow. Thank you. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Mas, silakan maju, kita akan foto session bersama, all of us.
Dari tempat kalau nggak bisa di bawah. Mas, duduk.